Hey guys, it's Nick, and let's talk the Seattle Kraken expansion draft. As the Chicago Blackhawks and the other 30 teams that are not including Vegas have put their exposure list out and protection lists of what players will be protected for this upcoming expansion draft. There were some surprises on the Hawks, yes, but there were not so many surprises. And frankly, there's really 4 players on the Hawks exposed list I think realistically could be picked up. One being a goalie, one being a forward, and 2 of them being defensemen. So let's get into the list, shall we? So for the protection, the Hawks are protecting Patrick Kane, which is understandable. He's the best player on the team. Jonathan Toews, the captain, he has a no movement clause, and he's expected to be back. Alex DeBrincat, who had himself one hell of a season last year. Then there's going into his second year in the NHL, Brendan Hagel was protected, which is great. I love Hagel staying on the protection list for the Hawks. Then Hendrik Borgstrom. And the surpriser that honestly came to me is David Camp being protected in this year's expansion. With Dylan Strome as well. He could have been exposed, but the Hawks just decided to keep the 2 of them, which is understandable. I like Camp because he brings that presence to the face-off dot that the Hawks do lack in. Then you have Caleb Jones, who we just acquired for Duncan Keith in that trade we made with them last week in Edmonton. Then Connor Murphy, best defenseman on the team. Riley Stillman, who brings that hitting presence, grinder defenseman, who's a good defenseman on the blue line. And then, of course, they're protecting Kevin Lakin and net. So that's who the Hawks protected. For who they left unprotected, Ryan Carpenter, Brent Connolly, Calvin DeHaan, who has a high contract, Colin Delia, Dickinson, Adam Godette, Vinny Hinostroza, Anton Lindholm, Brendan Peary, John Quinville, Zach Smith, Malcolm Subban, and Nikita Zadorov. Subban being on this list, being the fact that we can only protect one goalie, it's understandable. They protect this guy who was the starter during the season and let Subban go on here. I think Subban could be an interesting pick for Seattle. And then you have the most interesting pick is Adam Godette, who a lot of people were thinking could have been protected by the Hawks going into this expansion draft. I was in that boat too, but let him expose. So let's get into the list of players I think could realistically be picked in this year's expansion draft. So let's start with Calvin DeHaan, shall we? Who I think could be a pickup by Seattle, but somewhat I feel like could be not, just because of his cap hit and age. He's a 30-year-old defenseman with being the highest paid defenseman on the Blackhawks payroll at $4.55 million. That's the highest cap hit on the blue line for the Hawks. He played a total of 44 games last season, putting up 1 goal, 9 assists for 10 points. DeHaan, he's not a point producer, but he is more of a stand-back defenseman. He sits back and plays in his zone well. He's, yes, injured prone, and it does lead to him being slower on the ice, but maybe Seattle looks at him as a good veteran presence on their blue line. He could be an interesting player to see if he goes to Seattle. The next player is number 16, Nikita Zadorov. He's 26 as a defenseman in the NHL, with being on a cap hit, not with a cap hit right now. He's an RFA, so he's a restricted free agent. You have control of what you want to do with him. If you want to sign him or if you want to trade him, you have the control there. Zadorov is a big hitting defenseman. That's pretty much a good example of what to say. He brings grit to the blue line. He's big and he hits. He played a total of 55 games this season, putting up a total of 1 goal, 7 assists for 8 points. Again, not a point producing defenseman, but what he's there for is basically being that big presence on a blue line. This, I know, is the player that a lot of Hawk fans wouldn't mind seeing Seattle take here. And I think with him being an RFA, it could be an interesting move by Seattle to pick him up and see what to get, if they can get him signed to a contract. Because there has been talks that Zadorov has been wanting upwards of almost $5 million, and that could be a main reason why the Hawks are just exposing Zadorov here. Next pick here, I think Malcolm Subban here. He's a 27-year-old goalie with a very cheap contract. Yes, he's a backup, and yes, you're getting him as a backup. That's it. Because in this year's expansion draft, there are a lot of goalies in it. Like Chris Strieger, who probably ends up in Seattle, or Carey Price, and Capo Kakkonen. There's a lot of good, talented goalies. Subban I put on here just because I think, well, his brother's is unprotected by the Devils, and PK Subban being unprotected. What if the Seattle Kraken take Malcolm Subban and PK Subban and have the Subban brothers together? I don't know if that's going to happen, but anything could. Let's be honest. This year, in the 2020-2021 season, Subban played 16 games with a goals against average of a 3.20 and a save percentage of 900. And his record was not that good, but he was okay when he was in net for the Hawks. He had a record of 6-8-1 this season. Subban, I don't realistically think gets picked here, but I threw him up here just because it would be interesting to see if Seattle does go for him as a backup option. Next player on the list, and final player I think could be taken by the Seattle Kraken in expansion, is Adam Godette. The Blackhawks acquired Godette at the trade deadline. When he came to the Hawks, he played well when he was in the lineup with the Blackhawks. So the majority of his stats did come, though, from the Vancouver Canucks. He's a 24-year-old forward that can play at the dot and on the wing. He's also a RFA, so he's a restricted free agent. Godette played a total of 40 games this season, having put up 5 goals, 6 assists, 11 points. He could be a good young forward to take if you're Seattle. This is the player that a lot of people I hear do not want the Hawks to lose. And, well, yeah, understandably so. He's a young forward. We just acquired him in the deadline, and he looked great when he did play in the Hawks lineup this season. So, Godette being exposed for expansion this could be that one player that you could see end up in Seattle. He's familiar with that area because he did play for the Vancouver Canucks the last 3 seasons. And he's familiar with the Pacific Northwest. That's all I have to say. But he being exposed for expansion, he could be that player that Seattle sees and takes from Chicago. So, as you could tell, I put 4 players up. Zadorov, Haan, Malcolm Subban, and Adam Godette. Up as the 4 players I realistically think could be taken in this year's expansion draft by the Seattle Kraken. And yeah, I do have to say I do feel like Seattle probably does go the option of taking Godette because he's the youngest player on the list and they're working to build a franchise. You do want to get some young players. But I wouldn't be surprised if they take Zadorov if they want a big presence on the blue line and then they sign him. Who knows? I don't know myself. This is the expansion draft. You don't know what you're going to see happen until it happens. It's all up in air. What does Seattle do is that question. It's going to be interesting to see the 32nd NHL team come into the league and pick their franchise. Some of them could be traded after being picked up by Seattle in expansion draft. Some of them could just stay and be a cornerstone part of their lineup, as we saw with the Vegas Golden Knights just basically 5 years ago. This is an interesting time, expansion draft in the NHL for team number 32. So, down in the comments down below, I want to hear what your thoughts are going into this expansion draft. Who you think could realistically be taken by the Chicago Blackhawks, from the Chicago Blackhawks, I should reword that, to go play for the Seattle Kraken. So I want to hear what your thoughts are. Who you think the Kraken pick from the Blackhawks unprotected list. And thank you for watching the broadcast. Please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And most of all, let's go Hawks!